Ja, är du redo, Hasain?
Ja, väl det.
Det är väl det. Du är väl alltid redo?
Säg det.
Yes, Fabio är här så du får joina
vi får se om han...
precis. Men take it away.
Okay. Yeah. Fabio, I heard your voice.
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah. Okay, good. Positive response. Okay. Alshakarti är namnet. Det är säkert en del som har sett mig prata bubbla någonstans. Jag har varit med i konsultsvängen kring IT-säkerhet, cybersäkerhet och allt vad det hette kring säkerhet en gång i tiden och nu. Senaste, sen är mitten på 90-talet ungefär. Så det är väl ett gäng år. Senaste 16 åren snart på TrueSec AB. Fabio, kollegan, han får väl presentera sig själv, men är också en TrueSec.
Yes, and I will take this in English. Sorry for that. Yeah, but trust me, you don't want to hear my Swedish. It's going to take forever. So, yeah, Fabio Viggiani. I've been at TrueSec for, 7 years maybe. Have a background in like penetration testing, red teaming. Last few years, I work more on the blue side of things. Like instant response, forensics investigation, threat intelligence, a lot of that lately. So that's me.
Yeah, excellent. And Fabio is sort of leading our threat intelligence. At least he's a key member in that team, putting together our threat intelligence services. So this talk or this discussion is typically part of that kind of engagement. Let me just go ahead and share some. Let's see if we have it there. There we go. So we don't have any fancy PowerPoint slides. So I'm just sharing parts of articles. Okay, if that's fine with you. So this is an article from Microsoft about the SolarWinds timeline, as was laid out quite recently, actually. If we consider the detection, the first disclosure that was back in December and beginning of December, this is almost 1.5 months later. We have this timeline established. Okay, so the topic is the SolarWinds or SolarGate or Sunburst or a lot of different names for this same thing, depending on who you ask, what they discovered first, what they are describing, etc., etc. So there are a few names out there. Almost all of them are describing either the same thing or parts of the same thing. So just to give you a quick overview, we had a discovery of this beginning of December, right? So here, everybody in the world almost got to know that SolarWinds was somehow hacked, and then there were a lot of entities that were some of them hacked or breached because of or depending on the SolarWinds attack. So it was fairly soon or already in the beginning classified as a supply chain attack. So this simply means the SolarWinds wasn't the final destination for whomever did this. Rather said, the SolarWinds was just a stepstone towards the final destination or the final targets. We didn't have enough information when this was disclosed, right, Fabio?
Yeah, I was going to add that even before we got to know that, a couple days before that, I think, FireEye got out with some information about being breached. There was nothing about SolarWinds. This was not known yet, but they just said that, we have been breached. And it's an attack that seems to be performed by a very sophisticated actor that resembles the typical behavior of a nation-state actor. And they said that they got access to some of their red team tools. No 0 days, but still just their proprietary tools that they use in engagements for their customers. And yeah, that was about it, right? And then when SolarWinds came out, then they made the connection. Then they said, well, yeah, I mean, we were actually affected through the SolarWinds supply chain attack.
So simply, FireEye were probably one of many organizations out there running the SolarWinds software. As said in the beginning, we didn't really have any clue about the timeline. So there was very simple information about if you had the SolarWinds product updated / installed between March 2020 and till the time of discovery and the beginning of December, then you're probably vulnerable. So there was a couple of technical articles published by SolarWinds that encouraged everybody to update. There was an update. They said the update will take care of this problem. The backdoor will not be there anymore, or the malicious part of the product will not be there anymore, but without explaining anything beyond that. And then just a couple of days after that, we noticed that a lot of things started happening, especially in the United States. Where a lot of entities, governmental agencies, etc., more important global companies, including Microsoft, including probably Cisco, Intel, etc., a lot of these entities were actually using SolarWinds somehow in some parts of their global networks to monitor things and so on. So a lot of buzz started happening. We still didn't have any timeline to rely on and anything more to like, and then somehow somebody published information about DNS requests that was involved in this. Maybe we go back to the slides over here. Let's see. I was just sharing the web browser, right? So I will just reshare my whole screen so you can see if I do some other things here. There we go. So back to the article. So what happened actually, let me just jump to this part of it. Nope. Let's look at another article and jump over here. Right. Okay. Fabio, we had the chart, was it in the? It was in the FireEye article, right?
The flow diagram, you mean?
The slide diagram,
yeah. Yeah,
sure.
That is in the additional technical details article.
Yeah, exactly that one. We can start with this one though.
There is two of them.
Yeah, exactly.
What you're showing is, I think I'm actually on the phone driving, so I can kind of see what you're sharing.
No, I'm showing the one that came. What happened when the malicious update was distributed, etc. So it's that chart. Okay, so basically somebody managed to alter the installation base or the code base, or what we later on discovered or got to know that they actually didn't change the code base at SolarWinds. They injected things when the product was compiled before shipping. So when you look at the code, at the source code, the code base at SolarWinds, everything was just fine, no changes in there. So nobody could actually detect any changes, any malicious add-ons or something like that going on in the code base. What they really did, that was disclosed later on, is that they had a malware running on the SolarWinds development systems. And that malware injected the changes at the time of compilation and when they made the product ready for shipping.
So when they had this running, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So as the product was compiling, they just injected their pieces into that, and then it was code signed, it was packaged, it was put together as an installer, etc., etc. So
yeah, so it would be looking for. So you had this back to running on the build server, and it would be looking for execute. It would constantly monitor for process creation, and when there was a process created called msbuild.exe, then it would swap a source file and a particular class that they knew that was okay to inject in. replace that with with the additional sunburst.
Exactly.
And you can see also connecting back to what you're talking about in the timeline that actually Solarwinds said so they had the first injection of code was actually observed several months earlier. And that was threat actor code, but it was not malicious. It was not doing anything. So that was probably just a test to see that the whole process worked.
Exactly. So already here, there was like the test phase was initiated by the attacker. So already here they had a foothold in the Solarwinds system. They had control over their deployment and development and deployment processes. So they injected actually the malicious that became, or the DLL that became malicious was injected already September 2019 in the product. Somebody wanted basically to dry run that. So they injected the DLL. It was not doing any fancy thing. It just was there. So some people, when they went back and checked for the existence of that DLL back in time, so they said, oh, we see this DLL has been around since the September release 2019, but it had actually no code base that was deemed to be active or doing anything fancy. Was just lying in there, just dormant, is not doing any specific things. And then they probably tested that, I guess, another cycle, because there is a backdoor complied and deployed we see in February, and then through the release process, this was packaged and sent to the clients. So actually, the active period, or the period where most of the customers were hit or were affected, was from May and forward, May to December month, where this was disclosed. Most of the clients, the update was released March, and we all know about updates. Most of the people will know, most organizations will not put them as soon as possible. I don't know, that's something in the human nature maybe. So starting May, most of the organization have already updated, especially those who had like the automatic thing. There was an automatic update as well possible in the product, and so on. So later on, there's actually a missing piece here in the product, because, or it is actually here. It says July, the July month, the attackers actually removed the malware, or the malicious part of the malware, from the build environment. So this is another, like, you remember, from February to March, April, May. So from here, and then there was a release here. There was an update in September. Everybody who installed the update in September, they didn't actually have the malware on their systems anymore. Or if they skipped the May update and installed the September update, they actually jumped over that malicious version, so they didn't have it at all. This created a bit of a uncertainty because we were involved in helping some customers checking their systems, and when we backed in time, like checked at snapshot backups, the server backups, and so on, so we couldn't observe the malware or the malicious part of the malware throughout this period. And there was no mentioning at all that there was an update in September where the malicious part was actually removed. That came later on. So nobody could actually describe what that was or why that was that way. Okay. So the more active components, let's go here. So when this was activated in the system, when the update was installed, the malware part of the malicious part of the DLL was there. What it actually did, it started with pinging or just talking to a command and control center. Before that, it was actually checking a specific DNS name. So it did just a DNS request, and based on the response of that DNS request, it both announced itself to the system, the command and control system, and then it took a response as a command what to do next. So it can actually enable different states. The malware was pretty sophisticated. What it should do the next step, whether it was targeted, whether it should go dormant, whether it should go disable itself, and so on. It could change state forth and back between the 3 different states. The 4th state was more permanently closed down. So if it was pushed into deactivation and was deactivated permanently. The whole control chain, this whole the control we're talking about was performed by DNS requests and DNS responses, which is nothing new in the world of malware. I mean, Fabio is one of our good red teamers. We ourselves use that technology or that technique when we do red teaming. We use DNS to both transfer information and commands and so on. So it's nothing new.
I mean, DNS is a typical covert channel, but the way that it's more bluntly used is for an actual command and control channel. But that is in itself, depending on the environment, for some, for organizations that don't have any triggers on DNS traffic that looks suspicious, then you can simply do DNS tunneling. So actually tunnel real traffic through a DNS tunnel. But that in itself is quite noisy, because if you're just looking for, too many or too strange DNS packets, then you would find DNS tunneling. Most modern firewalls have capabilities to detect DNS tunneling now. But that's not what happened here. How it was used here, it was used more of a slow beacon just to get the initial instruction for how to move on. And also the fact that when the backdoor was running for the first time on the SolarWinds Orion servers, as part of the Orion product, it would wait a period between 12 and 14 days before doing even the initial request. So even organizations that actually have really thorough sandboxing for every patch they put in their product and let it run, maybe even 4 hours or a few days into a sandbox environment, they would not see anything, because you have to wait like 2 weeks before you even start to get the first packet.
So that first step was a delay. They looked at the date of the file on the file system of the DLL file binary itself, and then they added a random time on top of it. That was a minimum of 10 days or something, and then some random additional time on top of it. And then after that, they started to do the poking of that specific domain name. And whenever they started doing that, they added a lot of delays. So when you look at the source code, there were plenty of delays involved in here, and then a lot of dynamically adjusted timers. Okay, so it wasn't really very super active. It was just did a request. If it got a response that was valid, then it did the second request, but there was several minutes, maybe hours in between, because there was a dynamic decision on the delay. And then it was going like for another 10 hours or 22 hours or something like that, going dormant and then doing the next request, etc. So just as Fabio said, this is really hard to discover if you're relying on anomalies or defining the DGA type of behavior, dynamically generated DNS request, and so on. Very, very hard to spot. The second thing here is that the DNS responses going back were actually mimicking the behavior of standard legit services. So this means you would get a response that points you towards an IP address in your geographic location or nearby your geolocation. So that's very different from classic drive-by something type of malware attacks and so on, because they will point you at some hacked server somewhere in the world. They don't really care. This was really carefully designed, so it gave you a response that was in your geo IP area. Another piece, not to draw too much attention to what was going on, actually. Okay. So the way they responded back, let me see, that's a lot of descriptions in here. Here we go. I hope you guys can see this. Okay, so the client started always in a state that was called the new state. So this is the beginning. Okay, and when it did the first DNS request, it got an IP address plus eventually a CNAME bound to it. So classic response. So depending on the IP address block it received, it could do different things. So these are the 4 different types of IP addresses that could get back to it. So depending on what it got as a response, it was directed to do something. So either transitioning from the new state to the append state. The append state is the active state where it goes more talking to the second stage and so on, and could eventually progress from there to the third stage and so forth. Or it could actually output itself that says, okay, you're not interesting enough, so please truncate, please disable yourself. So some of these SolarWinds installation got actually the truncate command back. So they went from new state to terminated state or truncated state or disabled state. And some of them, as we observed when we look at some customer environments, they were actually pushed into the append state, and then they were pushed back to the new state again, and then they were pushed back to the truncate state. Depending on if somebody, probably somebody was looking manually at what clients are talking to us. Let's put them in the semi-active state or active state, and then they figured out, oh no, we're not interested in these guys, so let's push them back to the disabled state. So we've seen system that has been flipping forth and back.
You need to think, like, imagine from the threat actor perspective, having your backdoor being deployed over a period of time, but still relatively short amount of time, a few weeks maybe. You have your backdoor running on, I think Solarwinds said they have potentially up to 18,000 customers that had that backdoor or potentially downloaded that backdoor. So imagine having, like, from the threat actor perspective, having a command and control server where you have potentially up to 18,000 connections coming. I mean, you're going to have to figure out a way to make sense of where you are, because you don't really know where you end up, right? So you're going to have a logic to understand which ones are the interesting ones and have a strategy for moving on. So I would assume that there would be several layers here, like some initial scraping, for example, maybe something coming from certain countries you're not interested at all. Or maybe you're particularly interested in some countries, so you have automatically, if they come from there, or if the name matches something that you have configured on your server side, then you automatically switch to the next stage and then do another filtering later. So, I mean, I would only assume that this logic was built in the back end on their side.
Obviously, FireEye was one of these entities that were on their target list, more of the primary targets. So they went all the way from the new to the append to the progressing from the stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3. In terms of dropping another type of malware on the system and making another things start happening on that system. So if we would go back to the timeline over here, when things start happening May, that's where they started doing the transition from the initial state, the C2, to the second C2 state, to the third C2 state. So the initial was just the probing the DNS, getting what it should do, how it should react, and then if it was progressing, and then it will be downloading another piece of malware, Cobalt Strike agent or beacon, that was actively now used to do other type of activities on the system. And there are a lot of reports that these guys were actually doing a lot of low and slow type of operations. They were not in a hurry, sort of a thing. I mean, given the vast amount of organizations that were, vulnerable at that time, or possible to attack or possible to breach, they didn't have any intention seemed to be to do anything automatically, avoiding a lot of things. So what they did, actually, one of the interesting pieces of when we read the reports about the investigations that were done on FireEye and the other guys, a very interesting method they use is that they dropped a file on the system, but the file didn't execute immediately. So just to make sure that they are avoiding detection, the thing that dropped the file is not the thing that executed the file. So you put the file in the system and you go and make a change in the registry, like configure something as a debug to attach the process when the process starts. And then eventually somebody will start that process, and then eventually this file will load. What kind of time frame is that? Nobody knows, because eventually that component will start on the system. So dropping the file, dropping the malicious part that will take it to or run actually the C2 stage, or second stage of the C2 communication, was done by one part of this malware or malicious DLL construction. And then there was an unknown time, basically, until that thing got executed, because it was a total different thing that executed that. And they did that repeatedly. They did that very, very careful, very low and slow, as said, just to avoid all sorts of detection. Because a lot of the AI, machine learning, all of that, they will try to put together the story. Oh, A did this, A did this, A did this. So, and then there is a progression from A to B to C, and then that will make it to be caught and then identified. Okay.
If you want to add, like, the different stages of how this went were, just to summarize. First, when you have the backdoor running, you have the initial DNS request, so the DNS command and control channel. That is very slow, and it's only intended to basically tell you which stage to move on. And if you move to the next stage, so stage 2, then you can send, as part of the CNAME response, you send a new IP address, or actually domain name, to a secondary command and control server, which will be used for stage 2, which is an HTTP-based command and control channel this time. And then and that command and control server is, as far as it's known so far, they are unique servers and domains per target. So only the first DNS server is the same for each backdoor installation. But as soon as you move to the next stage, it's going to be a dedicated infrastructure for that target. And then the stage even after that, so stage 3, we can call it, it's when they drop Cobalt Strike and when they do the actual manual work inside the environment. And the second stage also has very interesting characteristics, because it uses a HTTP based protocol that is a proprietary Orion protocol. So it was actually part of the product they used. So they use certain messages within that proprietary protocol to send their own messages on top of that. So that's another really, strong factor indicating how much effort was put into this.
Yeah. So whomever looking at this, trying to analyze it, okay, it's an Orion product. It's using the Orion protocol. Yes, that's a new IP address it's talking to, but we don't know. I mean, Solarwinds host most of their services in the cloud somewhere. It's not necessarily on the Solarwinds IP subnets, right? So they do have things on the Microsoft cloud and on Amazon cloud and Google cloud and so on. So it's nothing strange that they pop up another service somewhere else. Actually, there were some really interesting names amongst these networks where the second and the third stage was hosted, within quotes, hosted. They probably get hold of some really nice subnets, really nice, let's say, corporate networks or virtual subnets or cloud accounts belonging to really nice corporates to host their second and third. So I don't know. Initially, there were some insurance companies in the East Coast side of the United States that was like going black for a couple of days when this was announced. So we do have thoughts about who these entities were. They were probably breached for the sake of using them to host the C2 servers, nothing more. And because they were so good names, nobody had any thoughts about, anything malicious was going on there. So they could progress that way, and they could just drop the one thing after the other and having all these hands-on things. And once they had command over the local system, they progressed from there, very classic way, towards the domain to gain domain control. And then from there, they were actually taking it the next step, which is we don't see a lot of regular attacks doing that yet, but I guess a lot of people have learned one or other thing from this, as that these guys were taking this from the on-prem to the cloud. They made that jump, and they were doing it in a very interesting way. They were looking for federation services. They were looking for single sign-on opportunities. They were looking for accounts that has that capability to jump from the on-prem to the cloud and so on. So if a customer was running like federation services like ADFS, for instance, they were going to that server or service and taking the signing keys and the signing certificates. So they could actually generate their own tokens, not necessarily on that system, but they can generate authentication tokens. So they can jump into the cloud services as the global admin or the admin that was synchronized from the on-prem. to the cloud. Once they were in the cloud, they started registering enterprise applications, other applications. So they started even putting together trust relationship between that tenant and other tenants. And then probably we saw a bit of a story that was telling that some MSPs were involved in some activities. Probably these were targeted as well. To make it easier for them to progress with their work. So imagine if you all of a sudden got a Microsoft MSP, been hooked up to your tenant as a management MSP, and then that MSP or some accounts in there are under control of the attackers, right? Once again, it does look normal, but there is a fishy thing in it, right? You didn't ask that MSP, maybe not even have a notification about it. Nobody's looking or something like that. So
that is interesting, right?
Yeah.
How they jumped from I mean in the MSP case that you mentioned, because there are reports of other high-profile companies like CrowdStrike that they don't run SolarWinds, but they were still affected. And the way that they did it is they first hacked into the provider of the Office licenses for CrowdStrike, and then from there they attempted to reach Office and other Microsoft Online products belonging to CrowdStrike. Now in the CrowdStrike case, they didn't use Office 365, but that seemed to be what they were after. So we can only assume that they've done this for other targets as well. So imagine this potential 18,000, which can be exponential in a way. So it's like from there, if there is any interesting provider of software or licenses or anything, then that can also be used to reach indirectly another target.
Yeah. So, but part of the initiation of this, the malware was collecting information from the local system, and all of that information was basically exfiltrated. So a lot of information was going out into those DNS requests, and then even in the first stage, the initial C2 communication. So probably somewhere have a lot of interesting information about a lot of organization, although they never progress to the second and the third stage in the process. So that's another interesting thing that we're probably going to see something tying back to this in the future, maybe soon or late, and then making use of some of that information because they know this, they know that, they know internal domain names, they know IP structures, they know other interesting things. As part of the information that was collected. So if we go back to the the Microsoft timeline again, there we go, or the timeline that was published. So starting and when this was disclosed in the beginning of December, what was untold was actually that Microsoft was involved in seizing control over the domain name that was used for the dynamically generated host names requests. Apparently, I mean, we know, those of you who are MVPs or have been in Microsoft and talking to their cybercrime unit, you know that Microsoft has a very good involvement with law enforcement in the United States and other parts of the world. So simply because somebody is abusing a Windows platform, Microsoft can process against them legally, and if they win the case, which they will do because there were no defendant there in the court, they can easily seize control over these kind of things like the command and control domain, for instance. And then what happened in this case is that actually whomever took control over that domain, it was actually going to Microsoft related servers, let's put it that way. They send actually the kill switch back to everybody. So when they did the DNS probing, they got the kill switch that says, hey, go to disable state, please. So if they had the vulnerable version at that time, in the beginning of December, whenever this shifted into a more controlled manner, then everybody got the kill switch. The unlucky thing here is that those organizations that didn't had enough, let's say, lifetime on their logs, on the firewalls, and on their systems, they couldn't actually verify whether they had the kill switch sent to them earlier or in the beginning of December. So they ended up in an uncertain situation whether they were actually, if somebody was running any of these states, like second or third state on their systems, or they were not really interested in their systems, and they just push them back to be disabled. Whilst we had other organizations who decided to very early, when they saw the first indications of this, to disconnect their servers from the internet, or disallow their servers to communicate to the internet. We see clearly that their system has been active. Some of them, at least, they still had the systems in the new state or in the append state. Apparently, they were not doing any active or fancy things, as far as we could know, for these customers. But we know that some of the customers were actually in the append state, at least going forth and back. When we start looking at backup copies, snapshot copies of those servers, we saw some of the servers were actually going forth and back between these different states. Although a lot of reports says that these guys were not really interested in European entities, as it looks like right now. They were more targeting the entities in the US. Another piece that was actually published or made publicly available is that some organizations does have information about DNS requests coming from, let's say, public DNS services, etc. So they collect that for doing academic work on it and research on it. So some entities published some of these DGA requests and the responses to them. And that's what made, among others, ourselves, go on and started doing some more investigation in these and decoding and seeing what's going on, because that what looked like a randomly generated DNS request was not really randomly generated, because it carried information about the domain name this backdoor was active on. So whomever on the other side of this, they actually knew what to respond to what entity, because they knew the domain name, the internal Windows domain name that was carried in the request to them. So they had a very good tooling already in the first request. They knew exactly who the customer was and whether they would respond this or that way. And they could, this was decodable on the fly. It wasn't encrypted, it was just encoded, together with a random piece that made this different. So every time the same request was sent, it looked like a different request. So this is just another way to avoid analysis, possibilities of analysis and similarities in that. They had a list of things to avoid. So they had hard-coded stuff in the malware to avoid being active when it was running in a sandbox, when it was running in certain domains. They had a list of blacklisted domain names. Most of them were related to Solarwinds themselves. So if they were running in like a Solarwinds debug and testing environment, pre-release environment, whatever that could be, they were not doing anything, any fancy requests or anything. They were just shutting down. We see some of them are related to like sandbox services, like the one you post your malicious binaries or you believe malicious binaries to, so they can test it for you, VirusTotal and other type of services and so on. And then there were some detection of antivirus, anti-malware, EDR platform software. So they did detect that. They did actually. It was very interesting because they had a list of AV and EDR products. So they tried to avoid them, but at the same time, they were really not trying to avoid the Microsoft Defender AV and EDR product. So they actually tried to disable the other AM services and EDR products, but when we looked at what they tried to do if they detected the Defender antivirus, anti-malware, or EDR product, they actually didn't even try to touch the registry keys to disable it. Probably because they know that it's running in a protected state, so you cannot even touch the registry keys for the Defender. It will flag it. It will, if you have the system configured to alarm on changes. non-legit changes on the registry keys, then they will be caught and discovered. So they were actually checking a lot of things, checking a lot of process names in the environment they were running, checking a lot of service names, existence of some domain names, and so on. So we believe, I mean, I don't know, Fabio, what do you think? The preparation time for this kind of malware, I mean, just looking at the timeline will give you some kind of sense for that, I guess. But I guess there is probably a year or so before this was active on the SolarWinds system to start with.
Yeah, and I would think a lot of this, it must have been built over several years of this group preparing. I hear an echo.
Yeah. So yeah, we've already seen reports that some parts of the software component itself could be found in other malware. So, and then there are a lot of strong relationship between the piece of software we're looking at and the APT group 29, right? So that's why all the indications, or everybody talking about this, they are all pointing out at the same APT group. And everybody almost believe that, yes, these are the guys behind it. It must be those because of a lot of reuse of code. The randomization algorithm for time is the same. The randomization algorithm for when you put together the domain name is the same. They use the same obfuscation algorithm, encoding algorithm, etc. They actually never had any clear text things in the file, like when they were looking for Defender or Symantec or whatever antivirus EDR platform. They didn't have the clear text version of the name in the DLL. They had a specially encoded version of that text representation. So they did a lot of things to be extremely low and slow and avoid all sorts of, oh, what is this thing? Why is this thing including a name? Why do they bother about Defender? Like, they shouldn't do that, and so on. And then looking at the code itself, they were actually mimicking the SolarWinds namespaces and the way they do the variable naming and function names and so on. So it looked like a legit SolarWinds product from start to end. So wherever you look, this reminds you of the same structure, the same type. It should be the same developers and so on. So you could actually draw a lot of parallels in between the pieces of code here and here, and the legit versions of whatever SolarWinds is doing, and then the malware piece that was discovered. Okay. Anything more you would like to add on top of this, Mr. Fabio? You see here some of.
Could be talking for hours about this. It's such an interesting and advanced attack. I mean, from a technical perspective, it's really probably the most beautiful piece of malware I've seen. But yeah, I think I mean the whole network part is quite interesting when starting to analyze, like you said before, the passive DNS and checking the request, the historical requesting, and mapping that to the response and to the logic that is built into the vector, like based on which IP block that the response IP belongs to, then you move to a different stage, right? So I mean, putting all that together kind of gives you a picture for, you know, even if it's a small window really, because, you know, we only have a very small subset of all the DNS requests that were generated. It still kind of gives you an idea for, you know, how they operated and who got which response and request and so on. So it's pretty interesting, but I think that we will probably never really know about all the organizations that were affected by this and to what extent, also considering that many of them were just used as first stage to then attack other targets in different ways. So this really explodes, and yeah, I think this will be something that will carry, even if we don't see it directly, something that will carry for many years from now.
So in this picture, this slide, or the description, the graphical description of what happened here, This is nothing happening within 10 seconds or so. This process, the whole process from 1 to 7, happened probably over the course of 1 week or something like that. So yes, number 1 started 10 days after, 10 days plus random number after the first installation or the existence of the binary. And then somewhere in time, it got back a proper response that could actually enable the next stage. So what it's doing, it's dropping the file at 2 and then creating a registry key. And then another wait time, number 4, when the process was created, because this registry key was the debugger attachment. And then when the process was running, then things started happening. So just imagine this is running over a course of several days from 1 to 7. And then the poor guy sitting in the SOC should see this and figure out this is malicious and we should stop it, right? And another very, very interesting, the DLL was just this plain standard .NET C# compiled DLL. No obfuscation other than the names, the text things in the DLL. No obfuscation, no anti-debug features, no nothing like that.
So it had to be the same as the original DLL, right?
Yeah, yeah. So it was in plain sight, as many described it, including Microsoft and FireEye. It was in plain sight, but nobody discovered it at first. We are actually quite amused about it. I think we can talk about people loving what they are seeing in front of them when we started analyzing the thing and then see, oh, okay, this was interesting. This was really amusing. This was really, really good.
Yeah, and we can relate to that a lot, right? I mean, we build custom malware for when we do red teams, and we do this whole, DNS logic and, custom whatever this and whatever that. And, we have a very direct feeling of how long time that takes and imagining to get that, first of all, working to the extent that was done here, and also being actively used in thousands of affected organizations. It really, it really puts things in perspective, and I kind of feel what they felt on the other side.
So since we're closing in on the end of today, I know the obvious question that many have asked themselves over since this we're open to the world. How can we as an organization protect ourselves against this kind of an attack? And I think we can do that in 2 ways. How can we that develops software protect ourselves from being what SolarWinds became? And the ones who are of us that are consuming software, how can we protect ourselves from something like this?
Yeah, well, the first part, obviously, there has been a lot of discussions about Microsoft did run SolarWinds, and then somebody had the chance to look at some of the Microsoft code repositories through the SolarWinds stuff. So if somebody has access to your code repository, that's not per se something strange or dangerous, not necessarily. It depends on how you do it when you actually put this into production, when you start compiling and then pushing this and so on. So what the lack of, or let's put it in this way, the possibility for the attackers to control the compilation and the deployment process. That's what made this thing possible. So obviously these servers were available, so they can do their operation across the internet on these servers, and these servers could talk to somebody outside of the SolarWinds organization. There are no, enough fences and walls and protection for these systems. So that should really be a very more hardened security layer somewhere that was missing in this case.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you think about how it was done this way, and how you could potentially make the perfectly secure development and build environment, there are ways that you can work with that, and there are things you can do. Probably going to end up in a very complex solution. It's possible you can get, for example, clones of build servers building the same things and checking that the artifacts corresponds and stuff like that. But it's going to be quite complex. And to be honest, this would not be possible if they didn't have full control of the build service already.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of steps, a lot of things you can do. You can protect yourself against, and you can detect, and you can respond to way earlier than they actually get to be able to do this. So, and those are basically no different than any IT environment.
So if this case was changing a legit DLL that should already exist in the system, or adding something, at least a checkup on, okay, we ended up with one binary too much after the compilation. Why is that? So probably no checks and balances in there, right? So there should be different possibilities to avoid it. But the second part of your question is that how could we as a customer avoid being, affected? Receiving something from a vendor you trust and you run their software, right? We cannot do anything about that. If the vendor either intentionally or unintentionally give us a malware in their product, okay? Now, the other part that made this attack successful is that actually those SolarWinds servers were having unlimited possibilities to talk with whatever on the internet. That's something we can control or we can change. That's something we should really be careful about, especially with powerful systems. They should not have unlimited possibilities to talk to anything else on the internet, right? So that should really be configured different ways. So why should a server that controls internal entities have that possibility, for instance?
Yeah, and I think it goes back a lot to also identify like dependencies and like you're saying, what are the important systems and why? If you would think, like maybe before this, if you would think of the SolarWinds Orion product, yeah, sure, it's a central system in terms of it has a lot of information about other systems, but you would not maybe consider that to be a critical system. But if you think of, like, what do things depend on each other? So first of all, like, if I end up controlling this system, what can I do from here? Like, what type of accounts are used here, and if I take them, what can I do from here, and so on. And also how, like, what is this system security dependent on? And in the case of SolarWinds, the Orion software, for example, is one of them. Well, we have a lot of other dependencies in our systems that we very often don't even realize we have, like, a certain library running in a component that is deployed by a third party that you have no idea about and stuff like that. So identifying all of those is a good exercise, but it's also pretty much impossible to do it thoroughly for everything that is running in our systems today. So a combination of doing that, but also making sure that if a system is compromised, you actually have control of what can be done from there, as well as, of course, detection capabilities, because we need to assume that systems are breached. So, and we need to be able to detect that as soon as that happens.
Yeah. And a lot of customers are actually using SolarWinds to monitor a complete environment, not just what it started with, monitoring the network. So in many cases, the SolarWinds server is actually a domain admin. Which makes it the perfect target for anybody.
So let's open up for questions from the rest of the group. What questions do you have for Hasain and Fabio?
I would want to ask, have you seen any more sophisticated attack, in the past 10 years?
Well, probably the attack that was performed on the Iranian nuclear facility. But that was done offline, which per se is awesome.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic.
This
but
is a
large scale attack like this. Have you seen anything more sophisticated?
I would say no.
Well, not directly, but you can. I'm trying to remember exactly what was the target there. I believe it was around 2006, if I remember correctly. A Greek telecom provider was breached. The whole story is not really, like, the whole conclusion is not really done, I believe, but the attack info, I remember the technical details. That's why I think it's interesting. The attack was done through IP phone equipment developed by Ericsson, actually. So they had an insider that was part of the the equipment ordering within the target, they actually managed to get a slightly different product in there than the ones they used to have, and that product had the capability to enable wiretapping on the IP phones. And then they remotely enabled that and basically wiretapped Greek government officials for several months. So I think that was pretty interesting from a technical perspective, and not only technical, but yeah, let's stay on the technical for now.
Yeah, that sounds impressive.
This is more global. This is like everybody else on the internet, not just the Greece telecom.
So and another question for me here: what are the immediate things that you go and do with your customers to help them to respond to this attack? I assume you have customers that have been affected by this, but also customers that have not been affected. What are the immediate actions that you ask them to go and do as a response to this to further secure their environments, or are all of the environments that you help customers with perfect?
Well, the investigation is very important, to really investigate and really understand what happened. There are a lot of customers, way too many, who just decided we shut down the server, we wait until somebody says something else, and then when Solarwinds declared that, hey, we do have a mitigation, and Microsoft said we're going to delete the malicious DLL and block the communication, they were happy enough and turned on the systems and updated them, and everything was just fine. We believe you should do a real investigation to understand if you were breached, what exactly happened. Which is somehow tricky sometimes, depending on the logs, depending on the history you have in your systems. But if you haven't done that operation, I would say, well, who knows what else laying around in our systems.
Yeah, so we're talking about several months that you need to go back in time, right? And we're talking about network logs, especially DNS logs. I mean, who has DNS logs even for an hour?
Yeah.
Imagine several months. So I mean, just that is kind of difficult, right? And basically, the only thing that we know for sure when we go and investigate an environment from a network perspective is the initial command and control server for the DNS communication. That is the only static one. All the others are per target, right? So you wouldn't be able to just search for an IP address even for the HTTP communication because you don't know the address. What you can do if you have enough logs is you try and go back in time and see any type of outbound communication from your SolarWinds Orion servers out to the internet, if you have that history. If you do, that will give you a pretty good picture. Then you can basically whitelist everything that it's supposed to be talking to. Should probably be nothing, to be honest, maybe SolarWinds, but you shouldn't really have much communication going from there to the internet. So if you have that, that's probably the best way to go. If you don't have network logs, then you need to start from the actual system and see, like, based on the state of the DLL, and it actually uses some settings on file to set the state of the malware. And so that would be a start to see, are you actually in a disabled mode or are you active? But that doesn't really tell the state that it used to be before. So that's still not really a guarantee that nothing happened. So then you need to kind of basically follow a little bit the unknown and kind of do, like, I mean, you have a starting point, you have the SolarWinds server. But then from there, you don't really know where to go. And if for a large enough environment, that's kind of like shooting in the dark. So you can only go so far if you have no things to follow.
Actually, I had one customer who they turned out to be extremely happy when they discovered their SolarWinds server was not updated for a year.
Yeah,
I'm actually happy about that.
Great. Thank you so much, Hasain and Fabio, for sharing. And I'm sure that Stefan, Fabio, and Hasain are happy to follow up on any questions afterwards as well.
Absolutely. And thank you for having us.